Now, may I request Mr. Manish Tiwari, Honorable Member of Parliament, to please come up and deliver the keynote address.
The Honorable former Governor of West Bengal and the former National Security Advisor, one of the doyens of strategic thought in India, Mr. M. K. Narayanan, former Air Chief Marshal Shri Arup Raha, General Mukherjee, Shri T.S. Sarkar, Shri Rajiv Singh, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Center for Eastern and Northeastern Regional Studies Research, Senas K, and the Indian Chambers of Commerce, whose centenary year this is, for inviting me to this very august and prestigious conference. It would be perhaps a trite to say that we live in interesting times. A phrase initially articulated by Joseph Chamberlain in 1898 and later exalted to the stature of a Chinese proverb. Let me commence by taking a long view of international relations and geopolitics, because this is a conference which is essentially dedicated to these two subjects. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that sanctified the construct of a nation state, in conjunction with the concept of raison d'etre propounded by Cardinal Richelieu in 1830, namely that each nation acts in its best national interest, and the doctrine of balance of power, the alliance system conceptualized by Hugo Grotius and first put into practice by William of Orange, later King William III of England, laid the foundational template of international relations that is valid even today, 4 or 5 centuries later. It was followed by the Concert of Vienna in 1815, when these 3 hypotheses were tested. It ensured an uneasy peace for the next 99 years, when there was no general European war, except the Crimean Wars from 1854 to 1856, till the beginning of the First World War in 1914. In May 1892, in a memorandum to the Russian Foreign Minister, Nikolai Girs, the Adjutant General of the Russian Army, Nikolai Obuchev, explained why the traditional method of determining casus belli of war had been overtaken by modern technology. What mattered most now was who mobilized first and not who fired the first shot. The undertaking of mobilization cannot be considered as a peaceful act. On the contrary, it represents the most decisive act of war, he opined. Within a month of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, on the 28th of June 1914, the doomsday machine of general mobilization unleashed itself upon Europe. Once Austria-Hungary and Germany started to mobilize, other European powers followed suit, and World War I commenced. By 1918, this Armageddon had left 17 million people dead. The Second World War was triggered by the imperatives of the alliance system, the balance of power. In 1938, German troops annexed Austria, and before occupying Sudetenland, a part of German-speaking Czechoslovakia. However, when the Nazis marched into Poland on September 1st, 1939, Great Britain, according to the terms of the Anglo-Polish Pact, declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. France followed suit, and the war dominoes were in full play. By the time it was all over in 1945, 85 million people were dead, and large parts of the world lay in ruins. It was followed by the Cold War. Great Britain's wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill, then leader of opposition, famously announced the commencement of the Cold War at Fulton Falls on the 5th of March 1946. He orated from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I call the Soviet sphere and are all subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in many cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. The alliance and mobilization templates were carried forward into the Cold War till the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union on the 26th of December 1991. In the calculation of war planners on both sides, the principal land battles in Europe would have been fought on the northern German plains, fit for attacks by mass concentrations of heavy armor. This necessitated the deployment of large conventional armies. Added to this was the MAD doctrine, mutually assured destruction, inserting into the dynamic of war a new paradigm called nuclear weapons. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book that was a sequel to an article that he wrote in the National Interest magazine in the summer of 1989, a couple of months before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. He argued that what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, that is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Essentially, what he argued was that the Western liberal and democratic model would be the default option of the global order in the years and the decades ahead. However, in 1996, Samuel P. Huntington wrote another book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. Huntington argued in his book that the epoch of ideology had reached an inflection point, and therefore humankind would regress into an age delineated by cultural conflict all over again. In his hypothesis, he argued that henceforth the primary axis of conflict would be along cultural trajectories. He postulated that the template of diverse civilizations as the pinnacle of cultural distinctiveness would evolve into a progressively efficacious matrix in analyzing both the potential for conflict and the genesis of actual conflict. He stated, and I quote, "This is not to advocate the desirability of conflicts between civilizations. It is to set forth a descriptive hypothesis as to what the future may be like." Both Fukuyama and Huntington were gazing into the crystal ball, trying to predict the ebb and flow of historical and Westphalian impulses in shaping the post-communist world order that had led to a unique situation of unipolarity in international affairs, with the United States emerging as the only hegemon after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the collapse of its East European satellite states that brought to an end the bloc politics that had characterized the post-World War II global milieu. On September 11, 2001, when semi-state actors put the only omnipresent hyperpower in the world, the United States, on notice by crashing passenger-filled jetliners into the World Trade Center, liberal democracy certainly had not emerged as the global choice. The events of 9/11 opened a new chapter in global affairs, wherein the war on terror became the new buzzword to invade nation-states that were tyrannical in their disposition, but by no stretch of imagination directly involved in the events that took place on the tragic September morning in New York. The invasion of Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, codenamed Operation Enduring Freedom, on October 7, 2001, was not a clash of civilizations, but a tactical attempt to get even with the masterminds of 9/11, namely Osama bin Laden-led Al-Qaeda, that had found sanctuary in then Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Almost 2.5 decades later, how do both these seminal treatises, the one written by Francis Fukuyama and the other by Samuel Huntington, measure up in predicting the train of global events since their publication in the 1990s? This becomes especially relevant at a point in time when, after the end of World War II, humankind is witness to a three-continent conflict playing itself out concurrently. These battles are the Russia-Ukraine war that began in February 2022. Hopefully there are ceasefire efforts on, which should fructify. The Israel-Hamas conflict, and by extension, Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, and Iran, that broke out in October last year, and the rise of China over the past 3 decades that has attained portentous overtones in large parts of the world beyond the immediate Chinese realms in North Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. The added dynamic, of course, is the latest India-Pakistan standoff, the worst after the Kargil War 26 years ago. The events in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021 that demonstrate that despite the United States spending $2.3 trillion on the war, almost $300 million per day, the country did not turn into a democratic haven for the Afghans. In fact, Afghanistan was the classical test case for Fukuyama's thesis, courtesy the direct involvement of the US for over 20 years. Neither was it a clash of civilizations, for if that had been the case, the United States would not have got into negotiations with the same Taliban it had ousted 20 years ago. The talks resulting in the Doha Agreement of February 29, 2020, paving the way for the handing back of Afghanistan to Taliban on the 15th of August 2021 in a rather ignominious manner, is a classical case of raison d'etre at play. Similarly, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, under the subterfuge of finding non-existent weapons of mass destruction, did not turn Iraq into a democratic utopia, but unleashed such tectonic forces across West Asia that continue to rise like apparitions after staying buried for over a century after the reordering of the Great Middle East in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1919. Neither was the invasion of Iraq a clash of civilizations, for if that had been the case, the Anglo-Saxon civilization would not have given up after expanding $3 trillion and 300,000 dead, the overwhelming bulk of them Iraqi citizens. It was again raison d'etre at play. Similarly, the invasion of Libya in 2011, under the rubric of right to protect, R2P, has neither turned Libya into a democratic paradise, nor was it a clash of civilizations by any stretch of imagination. The impulse was to get rid of Colonel Gaddafi's despotic regime, as the Iraq invasion was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Libya, unfortunately, has been a paragon of instability for the past 14 years. Likewise, after the collapse of communism in 1990s, China did not become democratic, nor is its ominous rise a civilizational struggle with other cultures. It's again purely driven by what China perceives as its national interest, the Middle Kingdom's destined place in the natural order of things. Therefore, the affairs of peoples and nations are still governed by two fundamental percepts, both dating back to the 17th century. The first, coined by Cardinal Richelieu, namely raison d'etre, and the second, the doctrine of balance of power, the alliance system conceptualized by Hugo Grotius and implemented by William of Orange, later King William III of England, as I had stated earlier at the beginning of this articulation. Technology and economics can at best be drivers, but are still not determinants. The determinant in the case of nation states, I apologize, I'm running a bad viral. The determinant in the case of nation states is still state sovereignty. Finally, a word about the subcontinent. We face a potential challenge in terms of a problem called Pakistan, a legacy of the partition, and now a rogue state for many decades on our western border. An aggressive China on the northern border, again the legacy of the conundrum between frontiers and borders dating back to the late 1940s. A fluid Bangladesh on the eastern border, and other states in the region that seek to hedge their bets between India and China, exercising their own version of the principle of balance of power. This seriously challenges India's Monroe Doctrine in South Asia. What then is the way forward for India? It is to listen to the sage advice of Cardinal Richelieu and act in our own best interests, as we did during the recent Operation Square Pakistan, from the early hours of the 7th of May 2025 to the evening of 10th of May 2025. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.